Okay, everyone, thank you for your patience. We are going to go ahead and get started. My name is Carlos Albin with ITS America, and I would like to welcome you to this ITS4US Deployment Program webinar, which is being sponsored by the U.S. Department of Transportation's Intelligent Transportation Systems Joint Program Office. Today's webinar is being presented by the University of Washington Deployment Site. So here is a copy of today's agenda. The purpose of today's webinar is to share insights about making digital transportation projects accessible and building team capacity in accessible digital product development. To kick us off, Kate Hartman will provide an overview of the ITS4US deployment program. Then Anat Kaspi from the University of Washington's Tasker Center for Accessible Technology will share some insights and guidance on creating requirement specifications for accessible projects. Once the presentation portion has concluded, we will open it up to stakeholder Q&A and share information on how to stay connected with the program. So a quick overview of today's webinar protocol. As you may have noticed, we have kept all participant lines muted, and that is to avoid any background noise for our presenters. We do ask that if for any reason your line is not automatically muted, please make sure you have self-muted your phone line. As always, we encourage you to provide any questions you may have in the public chat pod, which you will find on the lower right-hand part of your Adobe Connect screen. Our presenters will attempt to address as many questions as possible once we get to the Q&A portion. For those who may need closed captioning services, you can enable live captions by clicking the CC icon, which is located at the top cursor of your Adobe Connect screen. Lastly, today's webinar is being recorded, and a copy of the recording, along with the presentation slides, will be posted to the ITS4US Deployment Program website in the near future. If you registered for today's webinar, you will receive an email to inform you when the materials have been posted and are available for viewing. So with that, I will now turn things over to Kate Hartman, who is the Chief for Research, Evaluation, and Program Management with the USDOT's ITS Joint Program Office, and who is also the University of Washington's Project AOR. Kate, I will turn things over to you.
Hi, thank you, Carlos, and good morning, everyone. I think we actually have an event where everyone is still prior to noon, which is always a challenge with East Coast, West Coast projects. Next slide, please, Carlos. As Carlos said, I am the Agreement Officer Representative for the University of Washington program, which is part of the ITS4US program. This ITS program is a multimodal deployment effort. It's led by Elena Zlotchenko in the ITS Joint Program Office, but it's also supported by the Offices of Secretary, Federal Highway, and FTA, and within those offices with the Office of Civil Rights, Planning, Safety, and Operations. So we truly believe that we are multimodal and multidisciplined in our efforts here, which we hope goes to the betterment of the overall program. And the objective of the program is to support multiple large-scale replicable deployments that address the challenges of planning and executing a complete trip. As you can see here in the box up on the screen, the vision of the ITS4US program, not only is it transportation for all of us, but it's really innovative and integrated complete trip deployment that will support seamless travel for all users across all modes, regardless of location, income, or disability of those travelers. Next slide, please. The ITS4US program started in 2019. There was some activity on the part of the USDOT to prepare for this, and we went out with a broad agency announcement, had quite a large amount of interest, and we were able to select some really great sites. You can see them highlighted here. They're across the country. These are the actual 5 deployment sites that are in operation in phase 2. So we've Washington, New York, Iowa, and Georgia. Next slide, please. So a little bit more about the deployment phases. As I stated, that we had some pre-deployment where the US DOT was forming and pulling together the vision, the team, the procurement planning, and putting the announcement out, as well as evaluating the proposals. We have completed phase one, which was a planning process where the concept development and the various systems engineering documents were planned out, along with data management plans, outreach plans, all of which are posted on our website, and I believe that the links to all of that will be at the end of this presentation if you don't have them already. From phase one, we awarded the phase two procurement after the plans were approved. And the phase two, which is what we're going to be speaking about today for the University of Washington project, is in design and test. Phase three will be an operate and maintain, and evaluate, where we gather some of the data and do some performance measurement observations. And finally, part of this ITS4US program deployment is a 5-year post-deployment after the federal funding has ended requirement that the projects remain in operation. So we are hoping that all 4 projects will sustain their operations at least for 5 years, if not longer, because we hope that they are successful and really do help people regarding their complete trip. Next slide, please. I believe that the next slide is the transition to Anat Kaspi, who is with the Tasker Center for Accessible Technology and one of the incredible brains behind this program. Anat, over to you.
All right, good morning, everyone. Can you hear me okay? No. Are you able to hear me?
We can hear you, Anat.
Oh, okay, fantastic. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for that wonderful introduction, Kate. As Kate mentioned, my name is Anat Kaspi, and I'm representing the University of Washington project. I am the director of the Tasker Center for Accessible Technology and also development lead for one of the ITS4US projects. We've been calling our project the Transportation Data Equity Initiative, and the idea is really to create data infrastructure to support agencies going forward in producing consistent, standardized transportation data, specifically about transportation environments and transportation services that serve individuals with disabilities. A number of the different projects that we have are user-facing in the sense that they are application development as well as web applications, all of which need to abide by accessibility standards, and we hope to be able to provide that. In addition to that, throughout our project, we've been fortunate enough to work with really great partners. So I saw in the audience, Laura Lowe from HopeLink is here, and really a lot of what I'll be talking about is motivated by some of the conversations that we've had with our project partners, all of whom seem to have ranging uncertainties about building internal capabilities in accessibility. So as teams are working on digital products and have the best intentions and want to use best practices, standards, and guidelines for accessibility, but there's just a lot of information out there. It's pretty challenging to incorporate accessibility effectively into development processes. So the work that I'll be discussing today is really to maybe provide a framing that was helpful for us in terms of how to take the rule-driven, detailed information on specific rules and understand how we can effectively incorporate that into our development processes. So that's really the motivation for what brought us here now. And at the end of this presentation, I'll be happy to both take questions as well as for anyone who's interested, we actually have a document that's kind of associated with this presentation as well. So the goal of the discussion today is threefold. First is to surface and highlight business justifications for incorporating digital accessibility into the business process. Secondly, identify the challenges and open problems in building accessibility into digital projects. And then finally, help establish some kind of internal mechanism, at least highlight the ones that have been helpful for us in building accessibility into projects from the start. And so what I'd like to segue into now is that, I apologize for that. So let's go back to the slides, and we will hope that some of our participants are interested enough to see the experience of a person trying to use a number of different transportation-related applications and having some major failures using accessibility services on their phones. And so what that video was essentially showing, I specifically picked the experience of transportation applications, close enough to what a lot of us on this call are interested in, but not close enough so that anyone here is implicated. But essentially, as this individual was reviewing using a voiceover feature on their phone, how they might be able to interact with a number of different airline booking applications, they found that out of the 5 that they reviewed, only one was actually effectively accessible to the voiceover feature, meaning that everything was labeled properly, they were not confused, they were not thrown into a section that they were unable to get out of. And so 1 out of 5 is pretty abysmal. And really what it means is that there's a section of the population that ends up having to access these services either via a phone call, which in many cases nowadays incurs additional charges for booking a flight, or that there are additional hurdles into getting an actual ticket, or finally that you might ask someone who is sighted to use the apps in order to help you. And all of those are dehumanizing experiences that really no user should experience. And at the end of that video, which I thought was really nice, you know, the person who is an accessibility expert demonstrates how it is that they test these applications, but then at the very end just very frankly says that those experiences that were inaccessible just made them really palpably feel their disability, their vision disability, whereas the one experience that was seamless, that seemed to be intentionally designed with accessibility in mind, was, you know, gave them customer delight, essentially. And that's really where all of us want to get, right? We want all of our customers, you know, whether they use our trip planners or our booking applications, to feel that kind of customer delight, as opposed to the deep frustration and barriers that people tend to experience with these applications. And so, of course, I'm going to go through a number of business justifications for why we should build things accessibly, but a lot of these go without saying. So we can start out with just expanding our user reach. Developing both websites and mobile applications gives us, as you know, whether you're a business or a not-for-profit, we have an opportunity here to expand user reach, and specifically with the ITS4US program, we are focused on underserved populations, and so accessibility considerations really come front and centered. But those considerations do not only cater to individuals with disabilities, but much broader audiences, and we need to remember that there are many other populations that could benefit from having these accessibility features, whether we are targeting audiences that have temporary limitations, older adults, people who are just experiencing your application in challenging environments. Particularly in transportation, you can imagine that it's not always possible to view a phone, to visualize what is on a phone screen or actually hear what the app is communicating. So removing such barriers and making navigation simple and less fraught with problems can really enhance user reach in general. The next is just enhancing user satisfaction. I mean, it's tied to expanding user reach, but it's not just about accessing people. It's just when mobile applications and websites are designed with accessibility in mind, they're more intuitive, efficient, user-friendly for everybody. And inclusive features typically include having clear and organized layouts, as well as alternative text for images and seamless keyboard navigation, all of which can really increase user satisfaction because we never can truly anticipate what our users are going to bring, like what environment are they in, what input modalities are they using, as well as what output modalities. Next is brand reputation. You know, more and more DOTs are interested in having a good brand. And businesses and DOTs and transportation agencies that prioritize accessibility really demonstrate that commitment to inclusivity and social responsibility, and that becomes a way of driving external consciousness that, yes, this is something that we care about, and our organization embraces accessible design. Next is really about unlocking innovation. And I think this is something that's really important and often understated when we're talking about accessible and inclusive design. So being able to prioritize accessibility and having a team that's able to do that, we're challenging ourselves to think creatively and find innovating solutions to address different users' needs. And these solutions oftentimes lead to improved overall user experiences. They might inspire like totally new products or new services. And also, because we invest in accessibility early, we can position ourselves to adapt more easily to evolving regulatory requirements, market trends, or different customer expectations. And that, in effect, gives organizations a competitive edge in how we can increase access in the digital world. Lastly, business opportunities. I think that's important because it's connected to unlocking innovation, but the fact that you can move flexibly and agilely in a regulated environment means that increasing business opportunities is a possibility for your core team. And of course, I do have to mention, and now, you know, for those of you looking at the slides, there's a bit of a fume with liability. Yes, we are also concerned about liability concerns. At the end of the day, we are operating in regulated environments where there are rules and guidances about how to build accessibly or what are the requirements there. I think the important part for us, for our team really, was to figure out, you know, coming in with the best of intentions, how do we consume all the information that is out there about what is the regulated environment? How do we understand better what the set of rules are, and how do we operate in an ongoing basis where we actually build core competencies in this area, as opposed to just trying to sort of whack-a-mole down every rule set that comes along. And so that's really the objective of what I'm talking about today, where building core competencies in accessibility, specifically with a digital product team, means that we're not just allaying the responsibility of that liability concern onto one person or one team, but really building that core competency among and across our team so that we're able to identify early in an ongoing process when we are building in an inclusive, accessible way. And so we want our team to have a general understanding of a number of different cores, and then perhaps, depending on how your group assigns these things, have deep dives into some of these core competencies across the organization. And we found that this approach is both helpful within even a very small digital product team, as well as having like a more generic understanding of these core competencies that I'm showing, and I'll talk about each of them independently, but having a general understanding of those cores really helps in working with consulting firms and other subcontractors when we dole out some of that work that is user-facing. So what are these accessibility basics, basically? And of course, it encompasses a number of different areas. First, theoretical, meaning in terms of understanding the regulations and the standards that are out there. Second, have to do with practice. So you saw that, that Adi in the video is an accessibility consultant because they have practical life experience with the accessibility services that are being used out there. And of course, we always encourage people to actually employ people with disabilities in the testing phases, as well as on an ongoing basis. But part of the practice is to actually gain internal competency in using those accessibility services so that we can, on an ongoing basis, assess whether what we're building is accessible, rather than shipping it off to like a testing agency at the very end of the product cycle. And then finally, the part of inclusive design, which is a core competency that I think organizations often overlook because it's a little bit more nebulous at this time. It's less well defined. There's not just a single document you can go and read about it. But in the document that's associated with the slide deck, I did offer some resources that we have found useful in terms of understanding better how to do inclusive design and what that entails. So going through these 10 core competencies one by one. One is on the theoretical front, understanding accessibility regulations and standards, and there are resources for accessibility regulations. In particular, understanding content accessibility guidelines, those that are produced by the W3 Foundation, particularly the web content accessibility guidelines. Even if you're building a mobile application, those can be really instructive in terms of how they can be designed properly for web-facing applications, but also there is some content that can describe how it can be applied to transportation information technologies in particular. And then third on the core competencies in theory is documentation and accessibility guidelines. So there are a number of documents as well as videos from W3C that provides information about how to develop accessibility and accessibly, and what are some of the accessibility fundamentals. And they really do keep it fairly high level, at least at the initial practice, so it's not daunting or overwhelming. And our team over time has developed a practice of, we watch the videos sort of once a week. We did one 5-minute video at a time so that we can build that core competency across the team. And so people had a much better, even if they weren't developers, they had a much better internal understanding of what it is that's required, or what is the experience of users as they use digital technologies. How does that relate to some of the regulations and standards that are out there? The next sort of category of core competencies has to do with practice. So obviously theoretical knowledge is not sufficient for ensuring digital accessibility, and so within our development team, our developers have to understand the nuances of how to use screen readers, which read aloud extensions can we use in Chrome or Safari, etc. And so that really has to go into like the experiential aspect of using those both accessible input as well as output devices so that developers are even aware of the challenges that are faced by people as they try to navigate complex menus or try to understand instructions. So the core competencies there are one, to develop the know-how to do continuous accessibility monitoring. So every time we add a feature, we do that kind of assessment internally, and it's really important to do that, even if you're not constantly, asking whether it be subcontractors or assessment firms to do the accessibility assessment. It's really enhancing to your own product development process to be able to check those things on the fly as you go. Next is a deep understanding of assistive technologies and gaining core competency there. And one of our team members who does use assistive technologies on an ongoing basis mentioned that part of this core competency really is to engage people who use these assistive technologies on an ongoing basis to teach us how to use them. They're constantly changing as well because both the iOS and Android environments as well as different browsers are constantly enhancing their own accessibility services there, and so keeping up to date on what the assistive technologies are, how they're currently being used is part of this practical core competency. Next is collaborating with accessibility experts, and that includes people with lived experience, but also people who are ongoing consultants for accessibility. Again, that brings you up to date to what's happening in the field that is constantly changing and has a lot of uncertainties associated with it. And that collaboration doesn't have to be, a weekly meeting. It's just something that really enhances your team's understanding of who might be the users. And again, because we are engaged with the ITS4US project, we are constantly on the lookout on how we're better serving populations that have been traditionally underserved by both the digital and the physical environment. And lastly, as far as core competencies for practical terms, is staying current with accessibility training and awareness resources. So that is something that I think is hard to scope time for because we're all very busy and our development schedules are so quick turnaround, but is very important in terms of understanding what's happening. If I would say one thing, for example, staying current also means understanding, what is the current conversation about AI-driven accessibility companies. There's a big dialogue about this in the social media arena, and there are even some lawsuits that are currently happening regarding these AI-driven accessibility technologies out there. And so staying current even with that is really sort of important for teams that are intending to potentially outsource some of their accessible development. And then finally, as I said, the last category is inclusive design, which as an engineer was the hardest one for me to kind of enter into, but was actually the most, I think, illuminating. It's inclusive design approaches involve actively engaging with different populations in the design and the testing process, and not only soliciting feedback from people with disabilities regarding the accessibility and user experience of something, but also actively engaging with advocacy groups in the development process. Developers can really identify overlooked accessibility issues and prioritize them. I think one thing to talk about explicitly, because we, for example, have been developing a trip planner for several years, and common lore out there is that a good user experience is a simple user experience. And there's no doubt that simplicity does provide greater outcomes for users who are on the go and trying to use a trip planner. However, it is common lore and not necessarily shown that simplicity has been equated to how people express their personal preferences, because we've had mass-produced applications out there, and I won't specify which ones, but we can all imagine that the large companies have really focused on a single search line item, a single place where you go and require and ask for directions. But that's not to say that users are less interested in a more customized experience. Maybe by now, a lot of these mass-produced applications assume that by the data that they're grabbing off of your phone or off of your browser, they're able to just guess what your customization requirements are, as opposed to actually explicitly asking you. But part of the inclusive design user experience is really about having a digital negotiation with your users to ask them, what are your preferences? Can you explicitly tell me what you want today? You know, if that's something that changes on an ongoing basis, particularly when it comes to choices, modality choices about your transit, choices about, you know, where you want to go, what kind of environment you want to be exposed to. Those are all things that change on an ongoing basis, and I can't I don't think as designers and engineers we ought to pretend that we can gloss over those individualities and just offer a single user experience, something that's, you know, canonical in some way, and that's necessarily simpler or better for our users, because it takes the agency away from our users in being able to individualize and customize their experience with your application or, you know, with your web development. So simple is certainly better in some contexts, but when it comes to customization, we don't necessarily want to be to have the one designer on your team decide for your entire user population what is that canonical experience that they can glum together, but rather, you know, provide some of those experiences so that people can click through quickly if that's what they want, but also be able to identify the very specific personalized options that they might want. And so what I'm saying here is really that inclusive design practices should really examine what has become part and parcel of like mass-produced apps and question whether user experiences are really characterized in the way that would completely serve these minoritized populations previously. And so that's what insight we have gained through looking at these last 3 core competencies, which were learning about inclusive design principles, doing better user research and testing without, you know, putting people into drawers, whether it be like, you know, classifying every manual wheelchair user that we worked with together, but actually looking at the heterogeneity across that population. And then finally collecting and documenting different case studies and best practices that allow us to understand our users better. And so assistive technologies are certainly a place to start, because this is, even this core competency 10-person list is pretty large. And so just working with those assistive technologies gave our team a lot of insight in terms of how to work through these, you know, rules that we have to abide by at the end of the day. And lastly, I think it's really important to ask, whose job is it anyway? Because oftentimes, and this is still very common practice among digital product teams, to assign one person or a dedicated team to handle the testing of product accessibility, and it might seem reasonable and provide a clear role distribution among the team if you rely solely on a single individual or a sub-team to address this development. It may get you to compliance eventually, but it doesn't promote good development practices. And really, accessibility is not an end, it's a process. And so it's crucial for the entire development team to build that capacity and assume roles in accessible development. And it has a multi-dimensional aspect as described here, right? It's the theory, it's the practice, it's the inclusive design, and that level of competency cannot be embodied in a single person or team. And so taking this as a capacity building approach, as opposed to just, oh, let's just get this checklist done approach, has really driven a lot of internal innovation in our team, and I think it allows people to grow skills in a wide spectrum of areas, and we found that there wasn't really a pushback in our team, but of course we're really small, and we've also learned from the experience of other teams, because a lot of the larger companies have actually both produced documentation as well as videos and webinars about how they internally build consistent development habits to achieve accessibility. So Amazon, Google, Humana, all of whom have really externalized what their internal processes have been to develop accessibility. And I won't mention Meta because I don't know if you've been, again, that core competency on staying current. Threads is not accessible out there, and they just launched this product. And so there's really a lot of contention about how that actually came to be and whether their team has the core competencies in this area. So of course they're going to be fixing it very soon, but you have to kind of think about how the implementation is actually going to work out, and that's kind of the segue to our next section. So on the implementation part, I think if we focus on three things that are requirements, not just about skilling up, we can stay pretty much tuned to the accessibility of our products, and that's asking developers to become familiar with and use the accessible widget libraries. So if you're not developing, if you're using both widgets as well as atomic elements in your builds that are intended to be accessible, you have a much better focus on accessibility, even if you don't focus on it every day. So essentially what that says is that you have a good foundation to start from, and these resources are out there for a reason, because libraries have been created to ensure that the accessibility features are tuned and parameterized correctly. And asking your developers to do that is really important. Then working with your designers to clearly document the different pages and views that they've created for the web page or web application or mobile application, along with what variable states those pages and views allow. So now I'm getting into a little bit more technical detail, but as all of us navigate through web pages, you know that when you're navigating through an app, whether it's on the web or on your mobile app, you're entering certain data as you go through. You check a box, you click a feature, you go on a link, and so every time there's a user interaction, that creates a new state, because that information gets put into the trace of what it is that you just did with that website or mobile application. And so having good documentation about what those different states are enable us to eventually enumerate all those different states that we need to ensure are accessible at the end of the day when the product ships. And then finally, do require testers to incrementally test pages and views as they are built, because that will give you much more coverage to the testing. than that sort of previous approach of like, okay, we're done building, let's ship it to the testers for that testing phase. So as far as implementation, what is it that we're going to be testing? And this is really where I think, I'm also running up close to the end of our time together, but having this kind of framing and really focusing on 4 pillar requirements gave us better access to addressing the specific rules. So as some of you might know, there are organizations out there that produced set of rules, whether it be the WCAG rules, the WAI ARIA rules, all of which give people a confusing window onto how to test for accessibility. And consuming the hundreds of rules altogether made it really hard for us to identify real technical specifications that we needed to be responsive to. But looking at those hundreds of rules as categorized along 4 major categories or pillar requirements made it much easier for us to kind of consume those lists of rules and understand how to develop. The main ideas are the main accessibility concerns that come up have to do with user interaction. And so particularly making sure that any interactive elements, any of those elements that require inputs, whether it be text input or a checkbox input or a menu pull down, any of those need to be fully accessible for all input devices and accessible technologies, and that includes keyboard devices if users are unable to use touch screens for any particular reason. And so that's kind of the one major category, a pillar requirement, that under it has a number of different rules and tests that you can perform to assess the interactive elements in your digital product. The next is the perceptible and viewable elements, anything that is readable, audible, has any kind of text content, and it communicates any kind of information with your users needs to be fully accessible to all output devices. So that means that you have to produce alternative formats for any content that is being viewed or listened to or read on the page. And so that is the second category of rules and testable features that goes into the accessibility. The next is, so a lot of people think that accessibility is just those first 2, anything you push and anything you hear or perceive is about accessibility, but then there are these 2 additional sort of pillar requirements that impact how people experience your application, whether it be web or mobile, and one has to do with document structure. So the overall view or page content needs to be structured in an understandable, clearly hierarchical manner that gives different output devices a similar navigation experience as well as read of the content. And in many cases, when designers go in and they want to be really creative, they feel like this is somewhat constraining in the sense that, well, the user experience here is that people get to choose their experience, and so in the visual realm. And so it's hard for them to really think about content ordering as something that is static, but it is something that is part and parcel of building accessibly, at least in the current day and age. So it's important to provide that hierarchical structure and a similar navigation experience for all output devices. And then finally, document styling. And I know a lot of people think that that might be sort of a part that might fall to the wayside, but really it's really important even for all users who use variable screens, variable types of devices. And so nowadays responsive design elements are really important, and some people know how to use that better than others, and you'll often see that even when I know that I use some mobile apps that when I pan them into landscape mode on my phone, it gives me a very different experience. Like I won't be able to see certain things that are in the portrait mode. That's exactly what that speaks to, but you would imagine that in experiencing that same app with a different output device, maybe a whole section would be inaudible to the voiceover feature, for example. So, or in a magnified screen setting, a whole set of communicated content would be invisible to the person using the magnifier on the phone or in the browser. And so that's what document styling is really speaking to. So I just wanted to say that for developers out there, there are a lot of resources out there, and it keeps growing. And so being aware of both development tools and testing tools that sort of subdivide along development for web content and web applications versus development for mobile apps. But there are many tools out there that are constantly being revised, and it's really, there are resource lists. We've provided one that really provides development teams the foundation for building accessibly and moving towards having those core competencies. And many of them have now been integrated into the development environments that people are using. So it's really rather seamless. I think it was much more challenging, let's say 8 years ago, when all of these tools were not widely available. And the last thing I'll say is that if you're interested in actually deploying this kind of methodology, you know, we've provided a list that takes all of the ACT roles, where ACT is a community of accessibility experts who took the WCAG rules as well as the WAI ARIA rules and really created pretty simple unit-based testable rules that people can take and test their applications against. And what we've done here is just take that hundreds of ACT rules and subdivide them into those 4 pillars that I discussed earlier, and also identified which sort of level of accessibility do they address, so that if you're incrementally building accessibility in your application, you can initially select those rules that speak to level A, and then select the rules and testable rules for level AA and AAA, eventually building into a fully accessible and a user-happy app. So if you have any further questions, I'm happy to take them, but also you can contact us to get access to, you know, the list and also the document that kind of is associated with this slide presentation.
Great. Thank you very much, Anat. And we have just under 10 minutes to address some of the questions that have come in so far. So we have several questions about, or we did have a couple of questions which were answered in the chat about the slide deck. So the presentations will be posted, the PowerPoint or PDF will be posted to the ITS4US deployment program website, and we'll send an email notification to those who registered for today's webinar once the recording and the slides have been posted. So Anat, we're just going to go here in the order of the questions received. And the first question I see says, how long did it take you to gain the rapport with the different groups and ensure they all work towards a common goal?
That's a great question. So groups, as everybody knows, are also organically changing. I think without naming any names, some groups were a lot more hesitant to engage with us, but over time, I think the biggest question for groups and advocacy organizations is like, are you in it for the long haul, or are you just gonna use up our time? So building that level of rapport is really about demonstrating that you're both, the intentions are clear, what you're building is clear, that you're continuing to build for accessibility and really have the intention of building that as a core capacity, as opposed to just using people's time to achieve the accessibility end as opposed to the accessibility process. I think by now we've been pretty successful at gaining traction with some local organizations that recognize that we're building this together, right? But I think like any human endeavor, there's a lot to be said for building trust and engagement. And as people change in different organizations, that's the legacy that your organization can have is really about providing, whether it be services or tools that enhance what it is that they do and their engagement with their own constituencies.
Thank you, Anat. Thank you for addressing that question. Before we move on, I also wanted to say apologies for the audio issues we had during the playing of the video earlier today. So I'm going to provide the direct link to the YouTube video in the chat now, and folks can access that at a later time. So the link is now in the chat for those who may be interested in viewing that video that was shared earlier today. So the next question I see, Anat, is did you ever work within the community to gain to gain insight from them, or did you select a control group?
We have a control group in a different study that we've run jointly with the Makeability Lab at UW. So the control group is a group of, I think it's now 400 participants who are university students that do not self-describe as having a disability. But that study did end last year, and so we haven't had that control since then, pretty much. There was a second part to that question that I missed.
Well, it was essentially just if you work within the community directly, or if you had, the second part was, or did you select a control group?
Got it. So I think we are working within the community. We have partner organizations that have engaged people with disabilities in working with our, both in terms of participatory design, so the process of just ongoing engaging people in like, oh, we have these new features, will you look at them, will you tell us what you think, and as well as in the use of the applications. And this can range among like individual community members who've just been really interested in, transportation or pedestrian, non-motorized transportation. And so there are these, I think oftentimes they're called the 10 users who show up to everything. Those are great, but at the same time, we've also partnered with advocacy groups and groups that have other reach in the community where we have, variable people kind of showing up.
Thanks, Anat, for addressing that question as well. Going back to sort of the collaboration piece, can you talk a little bit about how you gained the collaboration of the accessibility experts that you worked with?
Well, prior to our ITS4US funding, collaboration was really about just going out there, telling them what we are doing, asking whether they're interested in collaborating, right? Like a lot of the distrust in the community is about, are you just going to dump some technology on us and take off, right? And so building those relationships in the long term has been part and parcel of what we were doing. I will say now that we have more extensive funding and can do this at larger scale, we've been really successful at hiring people with disabilities to work with us, so that our team has now grown, and I don't want to mention numbers or names, of course, but we have people who use accessible technologies on an ongoing basis as part of our team, and that's just been a tremendous growth for us. And I think it's really, I think it's important to do this on an ongoing basis anyway, but we are really fortunate and feel fortunate to have the ability to do this.
Thanks, Anna. Thanks for addressing that one as well. We are at time right now, but maybe we can take one more question and then begin to wrap up. Next question I see is, in one of your earlier slides, you had a photo of a tactile map. How does that work for the person to get updates with construction on roadways and continual changes to pedestrian features on roadways?
That's really a great question. Okay, so the idea in what we're building for the tactile map tile project is that so the build itself, it allows you to download a 3D model of whatever current sidewalk information is currently out there. So the turnaround process ideally would be for somebody who actually has a 3D access to a 3D printer, it would be about a 5-hour turnaround. And so that would be the update. But I should say that we're currently working on being able to download those 3D models also for variable and dynamic displays as more and more of these displays become openly available. So that's kind of the long-term vision for that, because as we know, the information about the environment is dynamically changing, and so using those dynamic haptic displays or dynamic touch displays is really the long-term vision for that.
Thanks, Anat. I think as long as you have time, I might sneak in one more question here. So this one's a question that popped out is, how can one achieve an inclusive design when the available target users seem not to have an idea of what their preferences are?
Oh, that's an awesome question, right? So in AccessMap, you have, so I'll just give an example. In AccessMap, you have this user preference for uphill and downhill inclines and declines. And of course, many people don't walk around and say, oh yeah, my maximum uphill incline is 7.3%, right? Like that's just not something that a user knows. But at the same time, we were really not content with the thought of us determining what's like low, medium, and high incline, because that we understand that to be hugely variable. Like we have very athletic device users out there, and there are some who are reticent to going up hills, and what's low, medium, and high for each of those individuals is really different. So really the endeavor was about building these side tools that allow people to do that kind of self-exploration, to say, oh, this is the environment you're familiar with. When you go to the store alongside this block face, you're actually using an incline that is 7.2. Is that within range for you, or is that hard? And so people get to calibrate their own preferences so that they can learn what those preferences are in those specific terms that we can then push to the cost function or the direction providing algorithm to say, okay, your maximum uphill is 7.3 as based on the co-learning process. Now, a lot of people push back and say, oh, there's no way our users are going to do that because it takes a lot of time. And we have found, at least with our research, that people are spending on every trip that they go out on upwards to 4 hours of using different tools to explore that environment. So imagine for every new environment you might be going to, you have a new doctor and a new doctor's office. So you can imagine users who are going on the internet and using different types of tools like Google Earth and other tools that might be accessible to them to identify whether this route is a good path for them or not. And so if we're talking about the time investment that someone is willing to put in, I do think it's important to recognize that it's a totally different user experience to what you typify as a typical user experience, and your users are interested and invested in getting the best route that they can. Yeah, the tools need to be good to identify, you know, what is my personal preference, but people will invest the time to actually use them.
Thank you so much, Anat. I appreciate you taking that question. I know we are now 5 minutes over time, and appreciate everyone's engagement as well. Great questions provided throughout. I think what we will do is collect all the questions that have been provided and certainly share that with the University of Washington team. Perhaps there may be some follow-up to that as well. So before we wrap up, I just wanted to encourage everybody to stay connected with the ITS4US deployment program. On the current slide, you will find contact information for Alina Zlotchenko, who is the ITS4US Program Manager, and Kate Hartman, who is the University of Washington's site COR, as well as Anat Caspi, who you heard from today, who is the University of Washington's Deployment Site Lead. You will also find links to the ITS4US Deployment Program website and frequently asked questions. Again, just a reminder that today's session was recorded. A copy of the recording, along with the presentation slides, will be posted to the ITS4US Deployment website. You will receive a notification once those presentation materials are available. So thank you again to all of our participants for taking the time to join us and for your great engagement throughout the session. And of course, a big thank you to the USDOT and to the University of Washington team for their great presentation, and especially for taking the time to address the questions, in going over time to address the questions that we received during the session. We hope that everyone continues to stay engaged with the University of Washington's deployment site and, of course, the ITS4US deployment program as a whole. I hope everyone has a great rest of your day. Thank you.